The man Apple fired in 1985, a 30-year-old man was marched out of the company he had built with his own hands. The boardroom doors closed behind him, and in that moment, Steve Jobs, the visionary who had dreamed of putting a computer in every home, was no longer welcome at Apple. The world didn't see a revolutionary leader that day. They saw a reckless dreamer, too young, too stubborn, too unpredictable to run a company. Newspapers mocked him. Industry insiders dismissed him. Some even predicted he'd vanish into obscurity. But here's the paradox. Being fired from Apple was the best thing that ever happened to Steve Jobs, because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the most dramatic second act in corporate history. A story of exile, reinvention, and ultimate triumph. Jobs would return to Apple more than a decade later, not as a rebellious founder fighting for control, but as a wiser, sharper, battle-tested leader. And with him came a transformation so profound, it didn't just save Apple from bankruptcy. It turned it into the most valuable company in the world. Imagine it. The man Apple once threw out, walking back into headquarters, reshaping its culture, and leading it to create products like the iMac, iPod, iPhone, and iPad. The very innovations that redefine technology, design, and even human behavior. But here's the real question. How does a man go from public humiliation to building the greatest comeback in business history? That's the mystery we're about to uncover. Over the next few minutes, you'll hear the untold story behind Steve Jobs' fall and rise. You'll see how failure forged him, how exile transformed him, and how his return to Apple became a masterclass in leadership, vision, and resilience. Because this isn't just a story about computers. It's about what happens when the world counts you out, and how you fight your way back. And as you'll soon discover, the lessons hidden in Jobs' comeback aren't just for CEOs or entrepreneurs. They're for anyone who's ever been underestimated, rejected, or told they weren't good enough. This is the story of the man Apple fired, and the empire he came back to rule. Why does Steve Jobs' comeback matter to you? Why should you care about a story that began nearly 40 years ago in the halls of a struggling tech company? Because hidden inside this journey are lessons about failure, resilience, and reinvention that apply to every part of life. Whether you're building a business, chasing a career, or just trying to survive when the odds are stacked against you, think about it. Here was a man who had it all by the age of 30. A millionaire, a household name, a cultural icon. And yet, almost overnight, he lost everything. His company, his reputation, his identity. Most people would have disappeared quietly, maybe written a bitter memoir, maybe faded into the background of Silicon Valley history. But Jobs didn't vanish. Instead, he transformed. And in that transformation lies the power of his story. By watching this documentary, you're not just going to learn what happened to Apple. You'll learn how a man took rejection and turned it into fuel. You'll see how walking away from what he thought was the worst moment of his life became the foundation for his greatest triumph. You'll discover the fall, how ego and inexperience can destroy even the most promising careers. The exile years, how Jobs' failures at Next and his surprising success with Pixar sharpened him into a stronger leader. The return, how Apple, on the edge of bankruptcy, needed him just as much as he needed it. The rebuild, the brutal decisions and cultural shifts that brought Apple back from the dead. The breakthrough, the products that changed not just a company, but the entire world. And most importantly, you'll learn what Jobs' second act can teach you about your own journey. Because the truth is, every comeback starts with a setback. Every transformation begins with a moment of failure. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt rejected, if you've ever wondered whether you'll get another shot, this story will show you that sometimes losing everything is the only way to win big. So as we step into the next chapter, remember this. The Steve Jobs who left Apple in 1985 is not the Steve Jobs who returned in 1997. What happened in between is the key to everything. And that's where our story truly begins. In the early 1980s, Apple was on fire. The Apple II was a hit. The Macintosh had just launched with one of the most famous ads in history, the 1984 Super Bowl commercial that painted Apple as a rebel force ready to take on IBM, the corporate giant. At the center of it all stood Steve Jobs, 29 years old, a visionary with unshakable belief in his ideas, but also a founder still learning how to lead. Jobs was brilliant, charismatic, and endlessly persuasive, but he was also impulsive, demanding, and often clashed with the very people trying to help him. Inside Apple's boardroom, tension was building. The Macintosh, while revolutionary, wasn't selling as expected. It was underpowered compared to IBM PCs, expensive for the average consumer, and Jobs' perfectionism caused endless delays and cost overruns. Investors grew restless. Apple's board decided the young dreamer needed a partner, someone who could balance his energy with discipline. Enter John Sculley. The PepsiCo executive Jobs had famously recruited with the line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" At first, it seemed like the perfect partnership. Sculley brought corporate polish. Jobs brought creative fire. Together, they were supposed to take Apple to the next level. But it didn't take long for their relationship to sour. Jobs wanted bold risks. Sculley wanted stability. Jobs demanded relentless innovation, no matter the cost. Sculley pushed for products that could compete in the market now. The clash wasn't just philosophical, it became personal. By 1985, Apple was in turmoil. Sales were slipping, profits were falling. The Macintosh, once marketed as the future of personal computing, wasn't living up to the hype. The board had to choose: stick with their mercurial founder or side with the steady CEO. In a stunning move, they chose Sculley. Jobs was stripped of all real power. His projects were reassigned. His team was dismantled. The visionary who had created Apple's identity was suddenly a ghost inside his own company. The breaking point came when Jobs tried to stage a boardroom coup, attempting to push Sculley out. Instead, the plan backfired. In a humiliating reversal, Jobs was told he was no longer needed. And just like that, Steve Jobs, the man who had dreamed Apple into existence, was fired. Imagine the sting of that moment. To build something from your garage, to see it grow into a global company, only to be told by your own board of directors, "We don't want you anymore." Most people thought Jobs was finished. He had money, sure, but his credibility, his influence, gone. Or so it seemed, because what happened next would take him on a journey of reinvention. One that would prepare him for the greatest comeback in business history. When Steve Jobs walked out of Apple in 1985, he was only 30 years old. To the outside world, he looked like a fallen star, a founder pushed out of his own creation. But to Jobs, exile was not an end. It was a proving ground. He poured his energy and millions of his own fortune into building a new company called Next. His vision was ambitious: to create a computer so advanced it would redefine education and business. The Next workstation was sleek, powerful, and years ahead of its time. But it was also a disaster. The machine was too expensive, costing upwards of $10,000, and sales barely trickled in. By most measures, Next was a failure. Yet, hidden in that failure were seeds of the future. The Next operating system, built with cutting-edge software, would later become the foundation of Mac OS, the system that powers every Mac, iPhone, and iPad today. While Next struggled, Jobs made a side bet, one that would change not just his life, but the entire entertainment industry. In 1986, he bought a small, struggling computer graphics division from filmmaker George Lucas. The company was called Pixar. At first, Pixar was another money pit. It burned through Jobs' capital without much to show for it. But then came a breakthrough. Pixar shifted from selling hardware to creating animated films. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the world's first full-length computer-animated movie. The film was a global phenomenon, grossing nearly $400 million. Suddenly, Steve Jobs wasn't just a tech guy anymore, he was a Hollywood mogul. Pixar went public, making Jobs a billionaire many times over. But beyond the money, Pixar taught Jobs something priceless: the art of collaboration. At Apple, he had often been combative, impatient, and controlling. At Pixar, he learned to respect creative teams, to step back, and to let talent flourish. He discovered the delicate balance between vision and trust, a lesson that would serve him well when he eventually returned to Apple. These years in exile, filled with struggle and quiet victories, reshaped him. Next sharpened his technical vision. Pixar softened his leadership style. Together, they turned him into a more complete leader, someone no longer fueled only by ego, but by a deeper sense of purpose. And while Jobs was reinventing himself, something else was happening. Apple, the company that had cast him aside, was spiraling toward collapse. The stage was being set for a comeback no one could have predicted. By the mid-1990s, Apple looked less like the scrappy rebel that once challenged IBM and more like a fading giant stumbling toward irrelevance. The company that had pioneered personal computing was now bleeding money, drowning in bureaucracy, and losing ground to Microsoft's Windows. PCs running Windows were cheaper, more powerful, and everywhere. Apple, meanwhile, seemed stuck in confusion. Inside the company, chaos reigned. There were too many products, too many teams, too many ideas, and no clear direction. Apple was selling over a dozen different versions of its Macintosh computers, each with slightly different names, features, and price points. Customers were confused. Retailers were frustrated, and competitors were laughing. In 1996 alone, Apple lost nearly $1 billion, an enormous figure at the time. Analysts called it a sinking ship. Magazines ran cover stories asking, "Can Apple survive?" Some predicted the company had just months left before bankruptcy. Employees felt the weight of decline every day. Morale collapsed. Innovation slowed. Talented engineers were leaving in droves. The Apple brand, once a symbol of rebellion and creativity, was turning into a punchline. Even Microsoft, Apple's old rival, seemed unstoppable. Bill Gates' empire was supplying the software for nearly every computer in the world. Apple, once the underdog hero, looked like a relic of the past. But then came a moment of desperation that would change everything. Apple needed a modern operating system to compete with Windows. Their internal projects had failed, dragging on for years without producing results. So, in 1996, Apple's leadership began searching outside the company. And where did they look? To Next, Steve Jobs' struggling but innovative software company. The deal was struck. Apple bought Next for $429 million. On paper, it was just a technology acquisition. But in reality, it was something far more dramatic, because Next didn't just bring Apple new software. It brought back Steve Jobs. And suddenly, the man Apple had fired a decade earlier was walking through its doors again. Not yet as CEO, not yet in charge, but back watching, waiting, and preparing. Apple was on the brink of collapse. But in that fragile moment, the seeds of the greatest corporate turnaround in history were being planted. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he wasn't welcomed as a savior. To many inside the company, he was the ghost of the past, the young, volatile founder who had once been pushed out for good reason. He re-entered quietly, technically as an advisor after Apple acquired Next. But behind the scenes, Jobs was already maneuvering. First, he observed. He walked the halls, sat in meetings, and studied Apple's mess from the inside. He saw bloated product lines, endless internal politics, and a culture that had lost its focus. It was no longer the hungry, creative company he once built. Apple had become slow, confused, and complacent. But Jobs hadn't come back to watch it die. He wanted control. By mid-1997, Apple's board, desperate for a miracle, pushed out then CEO Gil Amelio. With no one else left to turn to, they handed the reins to Jobs. He became interim CEO, though the media jokingly called it ICEO. And from the moment he took power, everything changed. Jobs moved with ruthless speed. He slashed projects, cut costs, and killed anything that didn't serve a clear vision. At one point, Apple had over 350 different products. Jobs reduced them to just 4: a desktop and laptop for consumers, and a desktop and laptop for professionals. Everything else was canceled. Employees were stunned. Some were furious. But Jobs wasn't trying to please everyone. He was trying to save a dying company. Deciding what not to do, he said, is as important as deciding what to do. But Apple needed more than discipline, needed cash. In a move that shocked the world, Jobs announced a partnership with his old rival, Microsoft. Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen at Macworld 1997, pledging $150 million in investment and a commitment to continue developing Microsoft Office for the Mac. The crowd booed. Jobs didn't flinch. He told them bluntly, "We have to let go of the notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." This was not the same Jobs who left in 1985. He was still visionary, still relentless, but now he was pragmatic. He was willing to swallow his pride to keep Apple alive. Slowly, the tide began to turn. With fewer products, a clearer vision, and newfound stability, Apple had room to breathe again. But Jobs knew survival wasn't enough. To truly bring Apple back, they needed something bold, something that would remind the world why Apple mattered in the first place. And that breakthrough was just around the corner. When Steve Jobs seized control of Apple in 1997, the company was bloated, unfocused, and losing money fast. To many, it looked like a lost cause. But Jobs didn't see a lost cause. He saw a company drowning in clutter that needed to be stripped back to its essence. The first step was brutal simplicity. Apple was producing printers, cameras, multiple software tools, and an endless lineup of Macintosh variations. Jobs walked into meetings, listened for a few minutes, and then asked the same question. If we only had the resources to make one product, is this the one? If the answer wasn't a resounding yes, the project was dead. Within months, he cut Apple's product line from 350 down to just 4. His famous quadrant on a whiteboard made it crystal clear: consumer desktop, consumer laptop, pro desktop, pro laptop. That was it. No distractions, no extras, no half-baked experiments. The message was unmistakable. Apple would no longer try to do everything. It would focus on doing a few things brilliantly. But Jobs knew that products were only part of the problem. The culture at Apple had rotted. Years of decline had left employees cynical, risk-averse, and divided into warring silos. Jobs attacked this head-on. He closed off unnecessary layers of management, pushed teams to communicate directly, and re-established Apple's obsession with design and user experience. He brought back a sense of urgency. Deadlines mattered again. Quality mattered again. And he demanded excellence, sometimes with terrifying intensity. Jobs could be harsh. He'd call ideas garbage and push people to their limits. But those who survived discovered something remarkable. The impossible started to feel possible again. To signal Apple's rebirth, Jobs also turned outward. He launched the Think Different campaign in 1997, a bold piece of advertising that didn't sell a single product, it sold a mindset. Black and white portraits of icons like Einstein, Gandhi, and Amelia Earhart appeared with 2 words: Think Different. It was a rallying cry, both to Apple's customers and its employees. This was not just another computer company. This was a movement for misfits, rebels, and dreamers. And slowly, Apple began to rebuild its identity. No longer a confused relic of the past, it was reclaiming its role as the company that challenged the status quo. But Jobs' new inspiration alone wouldn't save them. They needed proof. They needed a product that showed the world Apple was back. Something daring, beautiful, and impossible to ignore. And that's when the iMac was born. In 1998, Apple unveiled a product that didn't just save the company. It announced to the world that Apple was alive again. That product was the iMac. It was unlike any computer anyone had ever seen. Instead of beige boxes that blended into office cubicles, the iMac came in bold colors, with a sleek, rounded design that looked more like art than hardware. It wasn't just a computer, it was a statement. Jobs and designer Johnny Ive wanted it to be friendly, approachable, even fun. The iMac had a handle on top, as if to say, "Take me with you." It was translucent, so you could see the inner workings, turning technology into something playful and human. The gamble paid off. In its first year, the iMac sold nearly 800,000 units, a staggering success that pulled Apple out of financial freefall. More importantly, it reignited excitement around the brand. Apple was cool again. But for Jobs, one product wasn't enough. He wasn't interested in survival, he wanted Apple to lead. So in the early 2000s, Jobs and his team turned their sights beyond computers. Music was changing. MP3 players were clunky, ugly, and frustrating to use. Jobs saw an opportunity. In 2001, Apple released the iPod. With its simple white design, iconic scroll wheel, and the promise of 1,000 songs in your pocket, it redefined how people experienced music. The iPod wasn't just a gadget, it was a cultural phenomenon. It changed how we listened, how we moved, even how we dressed. Suddenly, those white earbuds became a global symbol of cool. And with the iPod came another masterstroke: iTunes. Jobs didn't just sell devices, he built an ecosystem. By negotiating with record labels and creating the iTunes Store, Apple solved the piracy crisis that was ravaging the music industry. For 99 cents, you could legally download a song in seconds. Apple wasn't just making products, it was reshaping entire industries. From the iMac to the iPod, and eventually the iPhone and iPad, Apple entered a golden era. The company that had been weeks away from bankruptcy was now setting the agenda for technology, culture, and design worldwide. What's more, Jobs himself was transformed. No longer the reckless founder of the 1980s, he had become a master strategist, blending vision, design, and business with uncanny precision. The comeback was complete. Apple wasn't just back, it was unstoppable. But beyond the products and profits, Jobs' return carried a deeper meaning. It showed the world, and every person watching, that the greatest comebacks aren't just about winning. They're about redefining what's possible. Steve Jobs' return to Apple wasn't just a personal triumph. It reshaped the entire tech industry and left lessons that echo far beyond Silicon Valley. Before Jobs, Apple was a company defined by its products. After Jobs, Apple became a company defined by experience, design, and vision. He showed the world that technology could be beautiful, intuitive, and emotionally compelling. A computer wasn't just a tool, it could be a statement of identity. A music player wasn't just for listening, it could transform culture. Jobs' influence also redefined leadership. He demonstrated that one person's vision, combined with relentless focus and a refusal to compromise on quality, can change the trajectory of an entire company. But he also proved that vision alone isn't enough. It must be paired with execution, timing, and a deep understanding of human behavior. The ripple effects of his comeback are everywhere. Design-led innovation became the gold standard across industries. Companies realized that aesthetics, user experience, and simplicity weren't luxuries. They were critical to success. Vertical integration, controlling hardware, software, and services, became a model that others tried to emulate, from Tesla to Samsung. Brand storytelling emerged as a vital business tool. Apple wasn't just selling products. It was selling an ethos, a lifestyle, and an emotional connection with millions. But perhaps the most profound legacy is what Jobs' comeback teaches about resilience and human potential. He was fired, humiliated, and doubted. And yet, through introspection, reinvention, and relentless perseverance, he returned to achieve something greater than he ever had before. Jobs' story reminds us that failure isn't a full stop. It's a comma. Setbacks don't define us. How we respond does. He didn't just reclaim his company. He elevated it to heights that seemed impossible during his darkest days. And beyond business, beyond innovation, Jobs' journey is a human story. A story about stubbornness, genius, humility, and transformation. A story that proves, even when the world casts you aside, the right combination of vision, courage, and resilience can rewrite your destiny. Steve Jobs didn't just come back to Apple. He came back to change the world. Steve Jobs' comeback isn't just a story about Apple. It's a roadmap for anyone facing failure, doubt, or uncertainty. His journey offers lessons that transcend business and technology. Lessons that apply to careers, personal growth, and life itself. 1. Embrace failure as fuel. Getting fired from Apple could have ended Jobs' career. Instead, it became the crucible that sharpened him. Failure forced reflection, reinvention, and a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. Sometimes, hitting rock bottom is the catalyst for reaching higher than ever. 2. Focus is everything. When Jobs returned to Apple, he cut hundreds of products to concentrate on just a few. He showed that clarity of purpose and ruthless prioritization are more powerful than spreading yourself too thin. Excellence comes from saying no as much as it comes from saying yes. 3. Vision must meet execution. Jobs didn't just dream big, he executed relentlessly. From the iMac to the iPhone, he combined imagination with precision, design with usability, and innovation with practicality. Vision without execution is fantasy. Execution without vision is aimless. 4. Reinvention is possible at any age. Jobs was only 30 when he was fired and 42 when he returned to Apple. Age, status, or setbacks do not define your ability to reinvent yourself. Transformation is always possible if you're willing to learn, adapt, and persevere. 5. Culture shapes destiny. Beyond products, Jobs rebuilt Apple's culture. He demanded excellence, encouraged creativity, and celebrated simplicity. He proved that a company's culture, its values, discipline, and vision, is the invisible engine behind its success. Steve Jobs' resurrection is more than a business case study. It's a human story about resilience, vision, and the courage to keep moving forward when the world says you can't. It's a reminder that setbacks are temporary, but the lessons you take from them can last a lifetime. When you look at Apple today, the sleek devices, the devoted fans, the cultural influence, it's easy to forget how close the company came to collapse. But Jobs' comeback ensured that Apple didn't just survive, thrived. It inspired, and it changed the way the world thinks about technology, design, and leadership. In the end, the story of Steve Jobs' return is a story for anyone who's ever been told no, anyone who's faced rejection, anyone who's wondered if they could rise again. His life reminds us, failure is never final, and the greatest comebacks are the ones that redefine not just what you do, but who you become. Steve Jobs didn't just come back to Apple. He came back to show the world what's possible when vision, perseverance, and courage collide.